Okay, um, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be going over my custom position called What's Your Decision? And I've gone over this position a few different times in the past, um, and we've gone over the theory in this position and gone into a lot of depth. However, recently I've played some games in this position and discovered some interesting new things that I want to cover in this video. So if you haven't seen the previous videos on theory, it would be helpful to view those ones before coming to this one, but you could also view this one by itself, as we're just going to be analyzing some games I've played in this position that show some of the new developments. So with that said, I have 5 games actually I want to go over, and let me first go to the analysis of the first one. So let me configure the settings here, and let's use this. Sure. Okay. So in this custom position, there are several openings, and one of the openings is this f4, c5, and f5 opening, where white basically tries to get the rook out and attack this c3 pawn. And in an earlier video on this opening, I mentioned that this line g takes f5 is probably losing for black, and white is probably winning by force. And I said it a couple years ago when I made the video, and I think now it probably still holds true. However, there's a very interesting catch, which is that in the positions that occur, although I think the computer gives white a +1 or maybe even slightly above +1 advantage, however, the position is a lot easier to play for black. And thus, I've played a couple of games in this opening setup I'm going to show you where I said that black is most likely lost, but I've played a couple of those games and I've actually lost myself. So just going to show you a couple of those games and to show that this g takes f5 line is actually viable for black, where before I was thinking that it wasn't. And so before, the only way for black to defend, in my opinion, was to go c6, knight c7, and then knight b5. And now I would say that g takes f5 is also a viable move. So I'm just going to show a couple of games to start off that show that that move is viable. So let me show this. So this game was played in a tournament called Testing Grounds. And basically I invited some strong players to this tournament, and we played some games. So you can see I came second, and well, this game was from a previous tournament. The rest were from that tournament I'm showing. But okay, let's continue. So I play f4, d5, rook f3, d4. So my opponent is just trying to defend this c3 pawn, but I have e3, knight e6, takes, and bishop takes d4. So I'm just trying to brute force my sacrifice on c3, because after the knight takes back, I'm going to win this c3 pawn. So takes, I took on c3, my opponent plays c5. So right now we are in theory, and after knight f3 and rook c6, we're still following theory over here. And in this position, I said that yeah, over here you can probably ignore the engine. Just right now I have an engine on low depth, and also I'm able to actually beat the engine in this position. So humans understand this position more than engines, although engines can also still tactically win. So after rook c6, knight takes d4. My opponent doesn't want to take back because then I'll take their rook and then they won't be able to counter sacrifice on f6. So my opponent takes on f6, sacrificing the knight as they don't take my knight back. And now the key tactic, and this is all explained in the theory video earlier. I'll make a playlist of these, that white is able to win this queen in the corner eventually after sacrificing their rook as well as the knight, though they also took black's knight. And after that position, white is a little bit better. But I'm showing in this video that black has excellent practical chances. So bishop h5 was actually, I messed up the theory. I'm supposed to play rook takes c5 first, but my opponent didn't take advantage of that, and they took on h6. So after rook takes c5 check, b takes c5, knight takes c6 check, we're back into the theory line. The move order was off, and my opponent took with the rook, and now I took on h8. And as you can see, in a position like this, the engine is saying that white is slightly better, by actually even more than +1. And I know before I said that not to trust the engine because humans know this position better, but normally after the trapped pieces have come out, so white's queen has come out and black's queen's been captured, it's normally a lot closer to normal chess game strategies, so then the engine's more accurate. That's why I would sort of trust the engine's evaluation. I would sort of trust the engine's evaluation at this point. And you can see it's around +1. But I said in the previous video that white is most likely winning here, but this is completely playable for black, because if you look at this position, white's king is a lot weaker than black's king. So black is going to play moves like e6 or h6 and take in the center. They're going to bring their bishop maybe to c7 and d8 and try to checkmate me, basically. These bishops will also come alive. The knight can maybe come in as well. The rook can come in. Whereas for white, for black, this king on a5 is quite strong, and white's pieces aren't really in a position to attack the king. So in this game, my opponent played bishop d7, and this move apparently was a mistake. I took on f7, so if the bishop were to take back, then I can take the rook, and if the rook takes, I take the bishop. So my opponent, they played rook c8, and I took, they took, and I played queen f6. So actually over here the engine's saying that white is quite a bit better. But even in a position like this, it gets difficult to play for white. Note that white's knight is undeveloped, the rook is undeveloped, and the bishop is undeveloped. They only have the queen, whereas black has two rooks that are ready to come in. They have a bishop, and in a couple of moves, their dark squared bishop is going to come in as well on the attack. So they played knight b6. Now they're threatening to go to d5 with tempo and just bring their knight in. I played c4 to try and develop my bishop. And rook g6 was played. My opponent is kicking my king away. As you can see, in a complex position like this, both sides will be making mistakes. I could have played queen f7 there. So yeah, so queen a1 was a mistake. I think queen f7 is just a better choice. I was worried that maybe the bishop can come to e6 and harass my queen, but I guess first rook h8 would be played so that I can't take on h7. I ended up playing, I guess, a passive move of queen a1, and I'm bringing my queen all the way back, but I still kind of wanted to eye this diagonal so the rook cannot come to h8. And of course, these pawns, black's pawns and the bishop was kind of defending this square as well, so there wasn't really many places for me to go. So my opponent plays bishop d6. They're bringing their bishop in. After rook e1, there's cd8. And here I decide to sacrifice my rook because basically my opponent's pieces are kind of controlling all the squares on this open file, and I just want to defend at this point. Also, this bishop can be very strong in the future, as it can go on this diagonal, and then the pawn can come forward as well. My opponent decided not to take, and they played h6. So, as you can see, kind of white would be better in positions like this according to the engine, but black is kind of having all the attack, and I have kind of no chance at an attack. Like, this isn't really any threat. So after h6, I took this pawn on f5, just trying to gain some space for my king. My opponent took, I took back, then they took the rook, and then they took on g5. So my opponent is kind of breaking through my defenses. So if we go back a few moves, because the engine doesn't like this rook takes f5 move, I was finding it hard to defend. I thought I was probably going to get checkmated soon after something like taking on g5, and when I take back, then there's a checkmate on h8. So I don't know why it's saying king g4. That is very strange, because that's an illegal move. But okay, perhaps g4 would be a move, and then after taking, takes back. And now black is a lot better. So see, the engine's even finding, oh, so I guess after here, the engine would want me to go to g3 most likely. Yeah, so after king g3, as you can see, it's a very precarious situation for white. Knight takes c4 is interesting, but even this is g takes f4, king f takes f4, and maybe now the engine would want, oh, let's check the evaluation. This evaluation up here is like a game review, which is at a very low level. Let's see. F takes g4. Well, I guess this would give up the rook. My opponent also has the rook. But as you can see, it's kind of difficult for white to play a position like this. And maybe I could have hung on. I could have hung on in a position like this. But I'm definitely not really going to be winning a position like this, because see, even after takes, maybe this isn't the greatest just because this pawn here is under attack. But yeah, let's not do that. But maybe rook e6. Maybe rook e6 would be a move. So I'm wondering why it's taking quite long for the engine evaluation to show up here. But yeah, I mean, maybe a move like rook e6, just attacking this rook further after bring the knight in, then take with the knight. And yeah, probably I guess over here white has a pretty decent chances as well, because of these two pawns. But anyhow, it is a complex position where both sides could win. So after h6, I took the pawn trying to get space for my king, and we played some moves. And now bishop e7 is threatening a discovered check on my king. And I move my king out of the way, but then I have to give up the bishop. Now black is for choice here, although I do have many pawns. I played h4, Here my opponent sacrificed the bishop to attack my king. Played king f3. Now they took on c4. And taking on c4 does, they could have also tried to move their knight out, but taking on c4 kind of allows them to get their pawns going. So now my opponent is having dual threats. So one is like against my king, and the other is the pawns moving and promoting. So they took on c4, and then they took here, and they took. So now I don't have any pawns to promote. And as you can see, I'm just trying to survive in this game. So I brought my queen to the center, they defended, I'm bringing my knight to attack, and in this position, I took because I'm having no like checkmating threats really over here, and it's two rooks versus a queen and a knight, so if I don't have any checkmating threats, I can't really control the game, and my opponent's just going to promote their pawns eventually, so I tried to go for a perpetual here. But first I took some pawns. But as you can see in this position, there is no perpetual because my opponent's rooks defend, and I resigned over here because my opponent is double attacking my pawn on c6, and they're pushing a pawn through, and they're going to be able to promote. So just goes to show that that in the initial opening position, there are chances for both sides in this game after this line, which I initially said was just winning for white. And I'm just going to show another game in the position, which is this one. Let me get to the analysis board. And in this game, we played the same line, but my opponent played something slightly different. I'm just gonna change this for now. Okay. So let me go through the game. F4, F5, G takes F5. This is a common line, G takes F5, because it's the most natural line. So you'll get this position a fair amount of times. Yeah, so here I played the theory right by taking on c5 first. Bishop h5 and knight b6. So knight b6 was the first deviation, sort of, from the opening theory. And knight b6 is simply just developing the knight, and it's going to bring it in. So even the same sort of things that we'd expect, same sort of ideas that we expect from the main line is seen over here. So black's going to just be the one attacking me, and I'm just going to be trying to win with my extra material. So I played c3 to kind of maybe attack black. Knight d5 brings the knight into the center. It took on b4, they took. And then, yeah, I took on f5. The rook is sort of pinned, and my opponent developed the bishop. So we're kind of playing main line moves here. And once again, you can see, this is kind of off the line I was showing in my theory video, and white is like even better. They're more than like +1. It's like plus 1.5 around their valuation here. So this is a weaker engine, but it's still very difficult for white to play, and I ended up losing this game as well. So after queen d4, rook d8, and rook c5. So here I'm trying to win black's pieces or attack the king, just trying to play active moves. And so over here in this position, when I go for this d5 knight, if I were to win the knight, so the rook to take, and then the rook, and then my queen to take, then the pin on the queen is no longer there. But the reason why I went for this is because if I don't try to win the knight, or don't, like, there's not really too much active play for me to pursue in this position. So let's say I went knight f2 to try to go to try to go to g5. See what the engine is saying. Rook d7. Let's say I were to go to g4. Rook c, knight d3. bishop c7 or not. Okay, but there's knight takes f4, which is actually good. So let's say I have to move my queen. So let's say I move my queen back to a1, keeping the pin. Knight c3 kind of blocks the pin. Now if I take, then my opponent can take and my queen will be the one that's pinned. So if I have to go, yeah, and if I go back, then I'm allowing knight d3. And if I were to go into, let's say I went to e4, I wonder, I think knight takes knight takes f4 is the same move. So if I were to go back a couple moves, I go to e3, knight takes f4, and best play for me, queen f2. I wonder if I were to go back to a1, just keeping the pin. So queen, oh, there's actually checkmate in one. Knight takes g2, so I have to go, let's say, to f2. Then knight g6 check, bishop takes, rook takes, and the queen is out. So if we go back all these moves, yes, my opponent has really, they have brought the knight. They have brought this knight to a really good square. The knight on d5 is very powerful. And so I played queen d4, not allowing knight c3, and now you can see that actually the knight taking on f4 is a big threat. So when I went rook c5, right now if the knight were to take, then I could take the rook, which is why rook d7 was played in the other line. But now when I play rook c5, I'm faster than my opponent. So when I went and took this knight, that was kind of what had to be played, but the consequences, once I take back, my opponent frees their queen. And you can see actually in this position, white is actually better than black. See, it's plus 1.5. However, in a position like this, black is still going to be the one on the attack, unless I can, for example, bring my knight to c4 with the checkmate. But my opponent's structure, they're going to play f6, they're going to take, they're going to bring the bishop in, and black is still going to have the attack, which is why positions like this are absolutely playable for black. So I played knight g7 here, which the computer doesn't like, but I just wanted to stop my opponent's queen from getting into the game. So knight g7, my opponent plays f6, they're now attacking my queen and opening my structure. I played queen d8. Again, I'm just trying to keep the queen locked in the corner. After my opponent takes, bishop c7, queen a8, rook c1. Now my opponent's going for my pieces, and I go for my opponent's bishop because it's pinned to the queen. My opponent took, I took, and here I took with the queen just because if I take with the bishop, then I kind of trapping my queen on a8, because if I move my queen, my opponent will get their queen out and take my bishop on g8. So I took over here, winning the piece. And now I'm going to win this h7 pawn, and I'm just going to try to push my pawns to promotion. My opponent took my knight, I took this pawn. And now it's a pawn promotion battle. And which is interesting to note, because I said black's going to have all the attack, but once I trapped the queen in the corner, I was able to win the queen and the bishop. So now my opponent's not going to have their attack anymore. However, in order to do that, I allowed my opponent to get in onto the first rank. So if we go back a few moves, I'm trying to figure out where. Yeah, so here when I played this queen d8, I'm already allowing my opponent to, in the future, come to c1. And if I don't play that, my opponent's going to move their bishop. And then there. So if we're to, like, say, defend over here, my opponent would probably take here, and where would they put the bishop, actually? It doesn't seem like there's too much space. But if they were to play bishop c7, now my queen can't go to d8, blocking them. And if I were to try to develop my piece, maybe maybe we play bishop e6 or something. for black. And the queen is no longer trapped. And again, white has, and again, black has their pieces over here, which could attack my weak king, and my opponent's king is quite safe. So in the game, that's why I opted to go for queen d8, but the disadvantage is that my opponent can get the rook to c1, they can win my pieces, and after we get into a position like this, let me just check the engine evaluation here, and now at this point it's just a calculation pawn promotion sort of battle. My opponent though has 2 bishops and a rook, I have just 2 pieces, so maybe they can sacrifice more pieces for my pawns. Bishop d8 check, and you can see that because they have more pieces, actually even in this position when the queens are being traded, there's still like threats against my king. So my opponent made my king run around a bit. Here they're now using their pieces to stop my pawns from promoting, or like when they promote they'll sacrifice the bishop, whereas my opponent's pawn on a3 is going to be able to go through and I won't be able to sacrifice anything. So my opponent's extra pieces around the king side also help with their pawn promotion plans, and as you can see here, black is completely winning. So here I deter the bishop so it can take on g6 so I can promote. But after this, my opponent is able to trade off that queen for their remaining 2 pieces. And now they don't have any more pieces left to stop my pawns, but because they've been able to sacrifice, their pawn is closer to promotion, and actually when the queen promotes on a1, it blocks this h8 square. So at this point, I just have to try to push my pieces through, but my opponent has even more pawns, so they're able to stop me from promoting, and it looks like I'm getting very close to a promotion, but my opponent gets my king out to an area where it has no moves, and once I promote, there's a checkmate on the board. And so it just goes to show that line is very much playable. So that's the first development I kind of wanted to show in my custom position, is that a line that I previously thought was just winning for white, it might still be winning for white, but black has excellent practical chances. And now there's something else I kind of want to show, and this is another game that was played in the tournament, and I want to show this game. As it kind of shows some more developments in the 1g4 lines. So I showed some very complex lines in this opening I had one opening video on 1g4, and the theory hasn't really advanced much since then, but there is interesting move bishop b5, which I didn't cover in my theory video. I think I had c6 as the only move I covered, but now we have bishop b5 played in this game, and it attacks my rook, and so I defended it by playing bishop e2, and it allows a trade of bishops. If my opponent takes, my knight plays a move that it wanted to play anyways because it's attacking the c4 pawn, and after d4 I can take and win this pawn. So my opponent's idea is not really to take the bishop, but they're just the idea behind bishop b5 is just to develop the bishop to maybe a better square than d7, where it might, where on d7 it could possibly hinder their pieces. So just showing a few moves. I ended up taking the bishop. The king took. Actually, another interesting thing is that this a pawn, so black can play a takes b5, and now the pawn is moved forward more, which could mean that when white is trying to win the pawn on c3, perhaps the king could go back, but over here it wouldn't really be able to like escape. But you'll see in one of the developments is that in this opening, because there are lots of pawns coming forward, the opponent, one side, can kind of move their king out of the way and let the other side free their queen, but then all these pawns are there and there's no weaknesses to the king. So that's what I'll show in the next game. But this game, just to show a few more moves, knight e2, d4, I took, the knight took on f6, knight takes c3 comes with check, king a5, takes, queen takes, g5, queen e7, and g3. And actually, in this game, my opponent timed out. It was a correspondence chess game. But this kind of just shows a game of how the g4 line can go with the move bishop b5, and this can be seen over here. The engine. The engine, so I was going to say white is slightly better in this position, and it shows strategical maneuvering of the pieces, capturing of the c3 and f6 pawns, and an interesting game. And for some reason, the computer, I didn't look at this before, but it's suggesting knight takes, f takes, and I thought it was suggesting queen takes. Let's see. I had seen knight takes g5 on the computer. Again, this is a little bit lower depth because the computer is taking long to respond. But yeah, I guess that wasn't a line. So yeah, white is a little bit better, but this is kind of just showing that. I want to analyze this though. This is showing the real big development in this opening. So yeah, I'm going to show this one. So again, this is another g4 game, g4 c5, and so the opening kind of runs fairly similar to what I've shown, and I played c6 here instead of bishop b5, so we're kind of following the sort of ideas that I've outlined in my video. But there's an interesting thing in this game, and that is after knight ac7, my opponent, instead of opting for, I guess, moves such as f3, which reinforces this d4, and then trying to take on d4 and then take on c3 to free the queen, my opponent had a different idea, which is shown by the very first move actually in the position g4. So one of the things that this g4 move does is not only does it bring a pawn forward towards the defense of these f6 pawn, though this g4 pawn doesn't directly defend it, but it allows the knight to go to g3. But what it also does is it shows an escape square for the king. So now the king can come to g3, and the pawns can move, and then maybe the king can go to h3, and then another pawn can move, and the king can go back to g2. So g4 actually allows an escape route for the king. And what I'm going to show in this opening is that this is actually a new development in this opening, that this is a way that you can play the position. So my opponent brings the king back, they play h4, and they're allowing me to take on f6. So they're not trying to stop f6, and they're not trying to counterattack with sacrificing on c3, as is what happens in this opening a lot of times, and what actually happened in the other game that I won by timeout that I just showed, is that black sacrifice on f6 and white sacrifice on c3. But here, white is trying to move their king backwards, so I get my queen out, and the king goes to h3 because white wants to play g3 and move the king back further, like I was showing. After I develop the bishop, there's g3, rook c d8, king g2, bishop d6, g5, queen h8. And we arrive at a position where black has freed their queen, and white, while they have a knight in a good position to sacrifice, and their pawn can help, and they can also play f3. So the same ideas from the opening. White hasn't really gone to sacrifice on c3 immediately, and instead they've let black sacrifice, which happens a lot in this opening. But instead of the king being in the center where it could be attacked, the king has moved all the way back to g2, where it is a lot safer, which means that black doesn't really have a direct target to attack, and white could potentially push their pawns for pawn promotion because their king won't be weak by pushing the pawn. So this is a really nice new development for a way the position can be played. So after queen h8, f3 was played. So my opponent is still kind of making leeway on taking the pawns here and eventually taking on c3. However, they can't directly do it because I've brought my rook in to indirectly defend. My queen now is defending because I sacrificed on f6, so they can't directly take. But if that plan is always there, that white can take on c3, black is going to be it's like sacrifice and then sacrifice on c3. Black is going to be restricted in what they can do without allowing white to get off that sacrifice. And if white gets off that sacrifice, white could be better than black depending on how they make the sacrifice, because black's king is still in the center. And black can try to do the same thing with b5 and king b6, a5, king a6, and they can try to do the exact same thing as white, though in openings in a position like this, perhaps in some positions the c5 pawn can be weak once b5 is played, and the c5 knight could be sacrificed, the pawn could be sacrificed, and then the piece could be sacrificed on c3. So for example, if b5 over here is played, then white could potentially, in some lines, I'm not sure if it works here, I don't think so, but white could sacrifice on c5, and then they could go sacrifice here. I mean, they could take the pawn over here, knight takes d4. But I don't believe this works right now because the knight is pinned. So actually, if we were to go back a few moves, and if white can't actually take on c5, then if we look at what white can do, yes, it's interesting. White can actually has a plan to move the knight to f2, g4, and perhaps f6 or e5. King b6. Let's bring the knight to g4. For f5 is played. To g takes f6. Now let's say we take here with the rook. Knight takes. Queen takes. Just showing some moves for how the position can be played out. So even black can kind of get their king out as well. So white can play king h1 over here, just getting their king to maximum safety. I guess the computer likes d takes e3 here, but I don't like to move away from this protection. But a5 is interesting. Just keep pushing the pawns forward. And let's say my opponent plays e4, and then king c7. Oh yeah, e5, sorry, is a fork. f8. King a6. The engine is just saying for e2 is interesting. b6. h5. Is freeing up some space. Let's say the engine likes knight takes f4 a lot, which could be useful because knight takes and the bishop is going to take, and white's pawn structure is kind of ruined. So perhaps after h3, black can bring out, the bishop can go to h2, kind of defend that. And yeah, we could actually have a position where both sides move their king out of the way. And over here, it's kind of hard for black to make progress against all of white's pawns. And so a position like this is going to be a very slow maneuvering by white to kind of push their pawns forward. And once white pushes their pawns forward, maybe black can sacrifice or get into the position. But even though black's pieces are freed, they still are threatened by white's pawns. But this is going away from what happened in the game. So let's see. Let me go back to that. See, I was... so my opponent played f3. So this was after I sacrificed and then brought my king back. My opponent played f3. I played b5 actually. Knight f2 was played. And I played bishop e7. And what I was trying to do with this bishop is I was trying to play f6 and take my opponent's pawns, but also probably just try to reroute my bishop to maybe f6 in the future, which would be a better square. And also to free my rook so it defends over here. After knight g4, f5 was played and my opponent went to e5, which shows it's a very nice maneuver for my opponent to bring the knight to f2, g4, and then e5. And e5 is a very good square. Obviously, they can't come to e5 right now because I would have f6, and then my opponent, if they took, their structure would be damaged more. But if they go to g4, they kind of force f5, or else they're going to go to f6, and now e5 is a good square. So it's a very advanced strategy. And so my queen and bishop are free here, but they're not really doing too much, which is why this is like a new way to play the position. See, my opponent is all the time in the road to play king h1. I played rook d5. They played knight d3 actually. I brought the other rook in, then e4, brought it back. They brought the knight back here. And in this position, they're kind of forking my bishop and rook. So I could have gone to d6, I guess, but I went to see, if I went to d6, yeah, it's something I could have done. I decided to go to d7, and I saw the knight fork. I did see the knight fork, but I thought that this knight is really strong piece, so I'm fine if they take the rook, and they did. Rook takes d7, bishop f2, king b6. So now, because I can't really break through white's position, I'll just move my king to safety, like my opponent kind of did earlier in the game. So actually I was showing a line where black would bring the king to safety, but in this game I kind of did the same thing myself. But my opponent's queen is still trapped, so I brought my king out. My opponent is maneuvering, and you'll see they're bringing their bishop. I guess they wanted their bishop on g2, which defends their king, and also if the pawn structure opens up for my opponent, the bishop would be in a better position. So I'm going to maneuver my bishop to b6, which is going to indirectly defend d4. Or I just ended up playing b6 actually, but that was another plan that could have happened. And now my opponent, finally, after a bunch of maneuvering, they have their pieces ready to sacrifice on c3. So they're going to do that eventually. Yep, there. So see, in this position, black really didn't even have much to do in the position. And white was kind of more for choice. They did a bunch of maneuvering, brought their pieces to good squares, and now they're sacrificing when they feel ready. So, and if we look at the position after the sacrifice, it's actually anyone's game. The white has had more time to kind of, well, white has kind of put their pieces in front of the king and set them up optimally, but black was also given time to do that, and then white sacrificed on their own terms. The engine does like black slightly better here, but at this point it's anybody's game. And I thought white had better chances because they have e takes f5, and it looks like their pawns are going to have an easier time getting through. But I guess they would like to play g4, but then the f4 pawn hangs, so they try to capture my pawn. First here I kind of trapped their bishop, then they took this pawn. They played g6, and they're able to win the piece over here. According to the engine, black is still slightly better, but I think it's harder to play for black this position, because even though white's bishop is kind of trapped, you'll see that white has some strong pawns over here, and it's going to be hard for black to make a pawn promotion, but white's pawns are kind of ready to be pushed. So I do have two strong bishops though. So after a few more moves, we ended up making a repetition. My opponent, yeah, I guess it was sort of like a even sort of position, but I didn't find there was any way to kind of push through my opponent's defenses. And I guess my opponent thought if they're going to move their pawns, then my two bishops and queen are gonna come alive against their king. So there wasn't much to do, and we ended up agreeing to a draw in this position. But I wanted to show this game because it shows a new sort of way to play this g4 opening, or even other positions in general, which is that instead of trying to focus on the f6 and c3 sacrifices, my opponent brought their king to safety early, and even though I was able to free my queen and bishop, I wasn't able to do too much against the position. And once white was ready, they were able to sacrifice on their own terms, and we were able to have a complex game. And that's why I want to show one more game in this position before we leave. That one game is basically the same concept I was showing, but it's in a different opening. So let me bring this one to the analysis board. So this is with the e4, knight e6, f4, c5 opening. My opponent actually plays f5 over here, which I would say, or at least based on my knowledge, it's kind of weakening because black can take on this g5. And that's what I ended up doing. First I took so that this pawn is not on e5 and defending this f6 square. So I took first, and then I took on g5. And after king takes, there's d5 played, and I'm bringing my pieces forward. My opponent defends. They bring the other knight in. I ended up sacrificing. I played knight e6 check, and that's just to open the rook as well against this pawn. Oh, was there a mate in 5 over here? Oh, there was. Rook takes f6. Let's see. Okay. Bishop h5. Wow, that is... and then queen f5 is mate because of the bishop as well. Wow, so that is a very strong... That's a very strong move, and rook takes f6 just wins. But I ended up playing bishop takes f6. And now there's no checkmate anymore. And it looks like my opponent's about to get mated, but after g4 and takes on h5, they move back. And now the king has kind of got to safety. And after queen f8, my opponent's bishop goes to d3. I move the pieces, and as you can see, my opponent kind of got their king to safety. And even though I sacrificed and got my pieces out, it's going to be difficult to play against my opponent. And I did miss one checkmating move there, which is why I still don't recommend that opening, because knight takes g5, if black can get that in, normally black is doing better. But I wanted to show in this position that I got my pieces out, but I'm still in this position. There's so many pawns, and the position's so locked up that black really can't do too much. So here I sacrifice the rook, just trying to open up some space. And if we show a few more moves, I bring my pieces into some good squares. My opponent is not able to sacrifice, but here I sacrifice the rook because I'm not going to make any progress against the king if I don't open up lines. So I made another sacrifice. But because my queen is out, I'm just trying to go against the king. So my opponent here, in terms of material, if we count freed material, this is 5, 10, 13, and then we'll count the pawns, 14, 15, 16, 17. And black would have 9, 12, 15, 16, 17. So we're not counting everything that's locked up on this side of the board over here. So as you can see, it's kind of like an even material game if we were to use that method of counting material. It's over here. I'm just trying to maybe sacrifice, or I wanted to take on g4, but right now my bishop's hanging. So I move my bishop back and is able to win a pawn over here. My opponent, though, won both my bishops. They're both light squared bishops, though, so they're not as valuable as two bishops of different colors. He play a few more moves. I'm able to win another pawn, so I think at this point my opponent is not going to be winning because I won that pawn. But if we go forward a few more moves, we traded all the pawns. I played a4, so I'm maybe keeping the possibility open of taking on on b3 and maybe in some lines freeing my opponent's queen but still winning, I would probably have to get my queen to f1 so that when it's freed I can play c2, and if the bishop takes, I can take the queen. So my opponent is doing a good job of moving their rook there to defend against it, and at this point we ended up getting a draw because there's no way for me to bring my queen in. So in a position like this, I couldn't really play. Let's see. If I were to try to go to d3 here, it would be too risky, because the bishop could take, and my queen is not on this rank to be able to take my opponent's queen. But my opponent is still here. And I think my opponent would have too many pieces to go against my king, where my pawns would be too slow. But from this game, the main thing I wanted to show was that, okay, I did miss a checkmating opportunity, but my opponent was able to get their king away from danger, and then even though my pieces were freed, it was very difficult for me to make progress. However, in both of the openings I showed, in both of the games that I showed with this strategy, the side that got their king to safety was only able to get a draw. I think the other game was more complicated though, so probably maybe not the most critical way of playing the position, but definitely a very playable strategy. And in both games, especially the last game that I showed you, there was winning chances for my opponent with that strategy. So that is pretty much it for this video. Kind of just wanted to show a couple of new developments in the custom position. And that's it. I have a few different custom positions I'm gonna show hopefully soon that I haven't shown before. But yeah, this was just to show a couple updates in terms of the strategy of this position. So hope you liked it.